This is the 16-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 Pro processor. Let's see what the hype's all about, shall we? The new redesign reminds me a lot of the old MacBook Pros, the really thick ones with all the ports. Even the Apple logo has been increased in size, although unfortunately it doesn't light up like the older models. Opening up the laptop, you get to see this wonderful new notch here, but to be fair, when I'm using the laptop, I don't really notice that it's there. And of course, you have a super large trackpad, which I love, and this new keyboard with a black well. In pictures, this doesn't look too good, but in real life, I gotta say, it looks really nice. Speaking of display, the new display is basically the same brightness as the old display for SDR content, but for HDR content, it is much better. The new MacBook has a 120Hz ProMotion display, although you're probably not going to be able to tell here, and the keyboard is very nice compared to the previous generation. And there's now a full-size function row here instead of touch bar, which I actually like better. While I have the laptop side by side, let's take a look at the difference in thickness. So if you look closely, there's definitely a noticeable difference in thickness. Putting the laptop on top of each other, you can see that there isn't too much of a difference when they're on top of each other. And here's a picture from the side. Looking at them from the side, the older one just looks a lot thinner. Overall, the new design, it definitely feels bulkier and heavier, especially when you hold both laptops in each hand. However, for someone like me, it's not too much of an issue. I mean, I have a 13-pound Alienware laptop here that I carry around just like those. But I can definitely see people online saying, oh, this new design is too bulky and heavy. And I can kind of see that, but there's always the MacBook Air. On the left side of the laptop, we have the new MagSafe with a nice braided cable. We have two USB 4/Thunderbolt ports, a headphone jack with support for high impedance headphones, and on the right side we have an HDMI, which is apparently 2.0B, not 2.1, another USB 4/Thunderbolt port, and a SD card reader, which is apparently UHS 2-speed, which is pretty fast. The one port it is missing that I was kind of disappointed about is USB Type A. I mean, even my microphone uses a USB Type A, and unfortunately, we're still stuck using these dongles. Looking at the side of the power adapters, this is the M1 MacBook Air's power adapter, this is the 15-inch MacBook Pro, and this is the new 140-watt power adapter. Now, it's quite a bit bigger compared to the previous models. Now, while it is bigger, it's actually not as wide, it's just taller, so it's not too bad. Let's take a look at the sound quality, shall we? So as you may or may not have heard, the 16-inch MacBook Pro has a really good sound system, probably best in its class of laptops of this size. The dynamic range is so good, and you can just hear the difference going between the 15-inch and the 16-inch MacBook Pro. This is how the webcam and the microphone sounds like. So what you're hearing and seeing now is from the webcam and microphone of the laptop. There is definitely some processing going on because my skin is not that smooth, but overall the webcam is pretty good. Alright, next let's go ahead and look at some benchmarks. One thing I wanted to mention is both iMac Pro and the 16-inch M1 Pro MacBook are completely silent while benchmarking. Looking at my old MacBook, it likes the thermal throttle instantly, and let's take a look at those fans. Alright, let's start with benchmarks. Starting with Final Cut Pro Render, you can see the video specs on top in parentheses. The iMac Pro did the best, with the M1 Pro MacBook being second place, and interestingly, the M1 MacBook Air wasn't too far behind. Converting this to relative performance, you can see that the newer laptop performed much better than the older one, but something with the iMac Pro is just doing really well in this test. Things get even more weird when we switch to ProRes from my iPhone 13 Pro Max. All the computers are basically within a certain amount from each other, except for the iMac Pro. I don't understand what was happening. I tried replicating this multiple times and I got the same results. If we convert the performance, as you can see, They're relatively close to each other, even though the M1 Pro MacBook is supposed to have dedicated ProRes hardware. Switching over to Logic Pro X doing a bounce, as you can see, the iMac Pro did the best with the M1 Pro right behind it, and the MacBook Air really close to it as well. The 15-inch 2017 MacBook Pro just gets completely dusted here, and if we convert the performance into percentages, as you can see, the other computers are just significantly faster than the MacBook Pro, with the iMac Pro still being in the lead somehow here. And that's where the king falls. In Cinebench R23, the M1 Pro's processor finally shines. It is doing the best in both single-threaded and multi-threaded. Comparing it to relative performance, as you can see, it's very fast. It's actually the fastest at all the computers. Interestingly, the M1 MacBook Air's single-threaded performance is very close to the M1 Pro's for obvious reasons as they're the same architecture. It wouldn't be an Apple laptop review video without peak temperatures showing how hot all these computers are running. As you can see, they all run pretty hot, and surprisingly, the iMac Pro and the M1 Pro MacBook, even though they're running hot, they did not throttle, and they were both basically silent, which is very impressive. Looking at Geekbench 5 CPU, the M1 Pro MacBook's processor shines once again in both single-threaded and multi-threaded performance. It does a really good job at beating the iMac Pro this time in multi-threaded performance, which was nice to see. In single-threaded, it was pretty close to the M1 MacBook Air. Now let's take a look at GPU performance. As you can see, the Pro Vega 56 in the iMac Pro does the best here, and the 16-core M1 Pro GPU is pretty good. If it was an M1 Max, it'd probably be beating out even the iMac Pro here. Looking at temperatures, they got pretty hot in the CPU department for Geekbench, but the GPUs were actually pretty good. The M1 Pro MacBook did get kind of warm at 74, but it was not too bad. Looking at battery life, it is no surprise that the 16-inch M1 Pro gets over 12 hours of battery life under my test. It is still below the 14 hours that the M1 MacBook Air gets, but is way better than the previous generation MacBooks. Next, let's look at gaming performance. Be sure to subscribe because I'm going to make a tutorial on parallels and crossover gaming for the M1 Pro Mac. For the testing, I'm using Wildlife Extreme Benchmark since it runs natively apparently on the M1 Pro and it's also cross-platform. And here we have my laptop with a 200-watt RTX 2080, my desktop with a 3070, and as you can see from the performance numbers, the M1 Pro is basically half the power of my 2080. This means that the M1 Max would be around the same performance as my 2080 if everything was natively running. And in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we have a few more Macs added here just for comparison's sake for you to reference. And I think it's going to be very exciting to see how this goes in the future for native programs. So the performance isn't that bad. The M1 Pro is about half of my RTX 2080 200-watt laptop GPU. The M1 Max, which is twice as fast, would theoretically be the same speed as my RTX 2080. The thing here is that there's no native gaming yet for these new CPUs and GPUs. Now, as time goes on, this might change. We're not sure. Gaming on a Mac hasn't always been the greatest thing. So if you're getting this just for gaming, don't. Get something like a Switch, Xbox, PlayStation, gaming laptop or desktop on the side, and use this for other things for now. Hopefully in the future that'll change. Overall, Apple has finally brought back the Pro in MacBook Pro with this laptop. Now, hopefully if someone from Apple is watching this, next year's model, please bring back a USB type A so we do not have to use dongles anymore, and then this laptop will be complete. With that said, as always, subscribe and I'll see you on the next one.